Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Reverend Lorenzo Lebrija, who is the Chief Innovation Officer of Virginia Theological Seminary and the founding director of TryTank Experimental Lab, an action laboratory for church innovation. Prior to launching TryTank, Father Lorenzo was the Chief Development Officer for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. He also served as the pastor on behalf of the bishop at St. John's Episcopal Church in San Bernardino, California, and as the priest associate at St. Athanasius Episcopal Church at the Cathedral Center of St. Paul in Los Angeles. He studied at the General Theological Seminary in New York City, where he earned his Master of Divinity degree. All right, welcome to the show, Lorenzo Lebrija. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
Hopefully I got your name right there.
You did. Well done.
Awesome. I had a moment of stage fright. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Well, I think the introduction said it all about my professional side. I guess on my non-professional side, my nephews gave me an emotional support llama. So it's this little stuffed llama that I take with me everywhere I go. And people now have come to associate the llama with my travels. And so they ask more for the llama and how the llama's doing than me. So there you go.
And here you go. You made me not record video. And
I know, right? Sorry. Because I wasn't prepared to record video. I thought it was only a podcast, so I didn't shave this morning. I'm wearing a hat.
Everyone's going to miss out on the llama.
Well,
the llama.
If they follow me on Facebook, you'll see the llama everywhere.
Okay, there you go.
In fact, people are now saying, like, shouldn't the llama, shouldn't you wash the llama or something? It's getting dirty and all. It's like all scraggly. Yeah, so there you go.
As a parent of young children, I'm well acquainted with disgusting animals. So,
but what I think this says about me, though, is that as important as the work we do in the church is, which is to bring people to Jesus Christ and to really just show them what the world and what our lives could be like, is that we don't always have to take it so seriously. Mm-hmm. That in there is life. That in there is the opportunity to laugh and to say, especially in the realm and the space of innovation, that we can be like, you know what? We messed up and we didn't kill the church. So let's just keep going forward. So I think having a sense of humor is important.
Yeah, I'm glad I appreciate the energy you're bringing to this already. So share a little bit about your faith journey, what that looked like coming to the faith and what that looks like today.
Wow. A faith journey. It's a deep, how long do we have? No, just kidding. It's one of those things. I don't think I ever did not have faith. I can't ever imagine or think of my life without faith. Even before I was what I would consider sort of like able to remember, have memories. Every memory I have has me seeing the world through like spiritual eyes. That was just the way I see it. Now, to be clear, I've never had an apparition. I've never had, like the Virgin Mary appear to me or talk to me or angels or Gabriel or anyone. So for me, it's always been that the world is spiritual, as Rob Bell says, right? Everything is spiritual. And I think I see it that way. Mm-hmm. So my journey has actually been about deepening my faith. And that's what I invite others who travel this journey along with me. That's sort of what my friends, family, everyone is just like, how do we go deeper in our faith? God continues to get bigger. Here I am, I'm about to turn 50 years old, and still I just keep learning more about God as revealed through Scripture, as God as revealed in my own experience of life. And so that's sort of what it is. Now, if you're asking specifically, like when or how did I decide to become a priest, that's different. My mom will tell you that when I was 4, I would put down the toilet seat, and it was perfect size, and I would put a towel on top of it, and I would celebrate the Eucharist in Latin. So did it start when I was 4, or did it start when I went to seminary at 39, almost 40, right? It's like, which one is it? And I just think there's been this call from God to just want to be more in my. So I love spirituality. I love everything about the spiritual world and exploring it and learning more. And I think that curiosity is what carries over into the work that I do.
Yeah, that's great. What are some spiritual practices that have been meaningful to you then?
Certainly central to it is the Eucharist. I think that while I know that God is everywhere and God is with me right here and God is with you right there and God is with us always, but there's something about that happens at that moment in the Eucharist, both as a celebrant, which is a unique and such a privilege to do, but also just as a participant to be able to see it. I really do think that that's a moment when we can sort of see a little bit of Jacob's ladder and the angels bringing down God's gifts and greatness to us in a palpable way, and also taking all of our concerns up to God. I think one of the greatest things that we can bring to the altar as an offering is all the concerns that we have, and just offer those to God. But in my day-to-day, I am situated, I am grounded in the daily office. I begin every morning. The first thing I do before I look at emails or texts or anything else is to do the daily office, to do morning prayer. I don't always get to do evening prayer or compline, but I certainly begin with just the daily office. Morning prayer grounds me in that this work that I am doing, which is so exciting and so much fun, is all about God and only about God. It isn't about me. It isn't about the church. It isn't about anything but God.
You know, I'm tempted, as you are Episcopalian and the Eucharist has been in the news, it seems like, over the last couple of years, to just change direction completely and ask you questions about the Eucharist. But we'll I am woefully inadequate to answer that. There are many and much smarter people than I that can answer the questions theologically about what that means. So I'm glad you're not pivoting. The daily office, though, is intriguing because I just think how I find myself just immediately in the morning, alarm goes off, you know, I'm turning off my alarm on the phone and then immediately checking emails. What do you think, what does that practically look like? I'm asking for myself, perhaps, for you to go straight to the daily office. And then B, how do you think that helps you versus that kind of immediate technological dive in that so many of us do?
And it's also very addicting to want to check, what happened overnight. Did anyone text me? Especially because you have to remember, for those of us who are on the West Coast, and you're sort of west, you're mountain time. I'm already beginning 3 hours later. So when I get up, most of my colleagues who are on the East Coast are already doing things. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, what have they been doing? What have they been up to? And how can I participate in that? But for me, the way that it looks is I get up, I stretch. I do one of those cat stretches, and then I just pick up my phone and I go and I sit in the same spot on my couch. I turn on some soft music in the background and I just open up an app. We have an app from Forward Movement that has the daily office, and I just do the daily office. It is all prepared for me, so I don't have to go and look at the readings, it's all there, and it just makes it so much easier. And what I really, part of it, what I like is when it has a saint of the day or a feast that we're celebrating, and it has a small sort of reflection on it or a little historical background on who that person is. And I just find that inspirational. And for me, beginning that way just gets me started in a more centered space than if I were to begin with an email saying, why didn't you turn in this form? This is missing, that's missing. When are we going to get an answer on this? So for me, it's more about how do I just remind myself that this is, and I actually see a difference in my life. But when I don't do it, I feel the difference that I didn't do that today. And likewise, the one thing that I do, he said do. The one thing you're going to be great, it's my
Chandler
kids
Bing.
all over again. Yeah, exactly. So the one last practice that I do at the end of the day, literally when I am about to go to sleep, is I do the examine. And I ask myself, what brought me life today and what took away life today? And it is life-changing when you do that. Just that simple question. I asked God to help point out the moment today when I just found myself closest to God and when I found myself furthest from God. That's what those questions ask. And it is amazing when you do that regularly, you start to realize that there are certain things that do bring you more life and that there are certain things that are taking it away. And then any logical person would look at it and be like, why am I doing that thing that takes life away so often? Why do I want to keep doing that if it's taking life away? I don't want to participate in that. I don't want to, so whatever it might be, whatever that thing is. So those two practices sort of anchor my day, beginning and end, and yeah, throughout the day, I'm reminded my smartphone goes off at noon to remind me to say "In Our Father," just so that again, it's like the monastic period, right? Why they have the bells to bring yourself back. It's like, yes, I'm having a lot of fun doing what I'm doing, but I need to be centered that this is for God.
I love it. I appreciate you sharing about that, and I'm intrigued how you're able to the technology. I'll say it this way. You're able to be the master of the technology, it sounds like, rather than it being the master of you.
Don't get me wrong. There are moments when I open it up and I see that there's several texts and I see that there's 22 emails in my inbox already. And even this morning, funny, I was about to and I'm like, no, prayer first. And it's it just becomes this thing. It's like prayer first. It also, it doesn't take long. Those 10 minutes when I go through the daily office, and also when the other part that I open is I have in my notes app, I have a list. So whenever I say to someone, it's like, hey, I'll pray for you, I literally add it to my note app. And so that's the other thing that I open. When I get to the intercessions, I look at it and I'm like, okay, and I'm lifting up this person for this and this person for that. And then I also do a little bit of listening prayer where I say, God, is there anyone else that I should be praying for? Let me bring them to mind. And oftentimes I'll be like, oh, okay, I'm thinking of my nephew today. I don't know why. And then afterwards I'll text them and like, hey, just thinking about you. I hope you're okay. Again, it's a considerably better way of starting the day than with an email from finance saying, hey, you forgot to attach this form. And I get those a lot.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, Lorenzo, great that you're doing all this travel. Where's all the receipts? I'm like, oh, damn. Oh, yeah.
We should talk about, I should ask you about receipt tracking apps here maybe when we're done.
Oh, I have a great system. It's the easy. I'll tell you right now. I have Dropbox connected to my phone. I create a PDF, and I begin always with the amount. So I always begin $12.95, and then Subway. And while I was traveling, and I just when I get my accounting from my expense report when I get the credit card bill, I'm able to match it because you're in Dropbox, they will always be by the amount. So I look at the amount, I'm like, nope, there it is, and I just attach it together. It used to take me several hours, and it's always in the same spot. So I don't have to save receipts. I just create a PDF, and I put it in there. And anyway, so that's probably more than people
know. Sounds great. All right, well, I guess it kind of relates.
See, I innovate everywhere.
Yeah, you innovate everywhere. There you go. So speaking of innovation, I brought on Lorenzo to talk about his book, How to Try Design Thinking and Church Innovation. And I don't know how I found your book. I think just talking to folks at your publisher, at Church Publishing, excuse me.
Or I'm going to go with the Holy Spirit brought it to you.
But I was intrigued just to kind of hear about or read about your story. So talk about TryTank, what that's about, and how you got into this.
Yeah, thanks. So TryTank is, we call ourselves, the full name is TryTank Experimental Laboratory. We're an action research proof of concept laboratory for the church. And every time that I say that to people, they're like, I understand that everything you just said is in English, but I don't understand that in the words, in the form you just said it, because they're thinking church innovation doesn't go together.
Right.
Well, here's what we do to put it sort of as easy as I can. We try to look ahead 10 years. We're 10 years looking ahead, where's the church going to be in 10 years? And then what we do is we try to come up with experiments of how the church can better live into that future. If it's going to look this certain way, do we want it to happen this way? If not, how might we be able to avoid, right? We know that the numbers keep dropping, so how might we be able to avoid every young person everywhere not coming to church? So let's look at some of those. And we also look at some of the things that are happening. It's how do we live more into those? And then we try to figure out how we can live more into those. And so we do experiments. And action research just means that instead of just doing it in a laboratory, so it's not just Lorenzo sitting in his office and just writing, papers and putting out ideas. Rather, we go out and we find partners. We partner, right now we have over 500 partner congregations, mostly Episcopal, but not all. And we actually tried with them. So I'll give you an example. Right now we discovered that 72%, so the Episcopal Church, mainly white denomination, only 2% Latino. Yet we know the country's becoming more and more Latino. So we're like, okay, how do we try to do that? But the big stumbling block always when you talk to people about Latino ministry is like, well, I don't speak the language. And now we can actually say, well, good news, they don't either. Because it turns out that 72% of Latinos in the U.S. either speak or prefer to speak English.
Interesting.
And you're like, that's an amazing opportunity because it means that language doesn't have to stop us from reaching them. And so what we're doing right now is we're trying to figure out something that is in culture rather than in language. And what would that look like? What would it look like if we had the ecclesiastical flexibility? In other words, if we were in the Episcopal Church, we're not used to doing like first communions, but it is a very cultural thing for Latinos. So, and we have nothing against marking that day. So what would it look like if we were to sort of bring those two together? And so we're exploring with 4 congregations around the country right now. What does it look like to do Latino ministry, but in English? And that's just the sort of work that we do. We sort of look at, we need to do more Latino ministry, and the way we've been doing it is one way, and it works well in some places, not everywhere, of course. But how might we do it differently? That's what we ask.
Yeah, I love it. I'm kind of a research nerd, so I really appreciate the research aspect.
I do a lot of research. Oh my God, I can. No one can see it like the llama, but I have a stack of books to be read. So if you were to look around, I have like tons and tons and tons and tons of books, and I just like read everywhere. I read research. I'm also, the fact that the TryTank is associated with basically a graduate school means that we have an amazing library with amazing librarians that help me do research all the time. So I'm incredibly lucky that way. Oh, going back to the story of how TryTank came to be, right? So we're like, all right, we're this action research proof of concept. In other words, we don't want to run ministries. We want to create stuff that others can then go, and particularly we look for things that can be replicable in different contexts so that others could do it and go to scale with them. And so the way that it came about, as most great ideas, was over a meal. I was having dinner with the dean and president of Virginia Theological Seminary. And we were talking, and we were just, as normally happens when church people gather together, it's like, hey, what's the future of the church? What are we going to do? What's happening? And we were looking at those questions. And at one point he asked what one should probably never ask someone like Lorenzo. Is like, hey, Lorenzo, if you could do anything in the church, what would you do? And I'm like, well, I'm a very much an ideas person. I love creating things, blah, 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 blah. It's like, so it would be kind of like a think tank. There'd be a lot of ways of how we might be different, how the Holy Spirit, because they have to be theologically grounded, right? This isn't, I was talking to people that up in Northern California, they're like, oh, you're like basically Silicon Valley, but for the church. I'm like, kind of, sort of, because they take things, they break them, and then create new ones. It's like, but we have 2,000 years of tradition that we don't want to break with. We want to bring that with us.
Right.
So how do we honor that? So all that to say, we want to come up with ideas that we can try. And we need to be able to ourselves lead that trying, because if you look at most congregations now, they don't have the time, they don't have the energy, they don't have the resources to go and try new stuff. They're in the day-to-day. They have a lot of things, especially during COVID. They're tired. I see them. I feel them in how tired they are in doing ministry. So I said, we need to be able to go out and ourselves try these things and find partners so that we can try it. And by the end of the meal, it could have been the Holy Spirit, or it could have been the wine that we were having. But we were like, we need to do this. We need to make this happen. And instead of a think tank, it's going to be a TryTank.
Yeah.
And there's the name.
Well, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but let me frame it this way. So in the book, you write that, or you joke perhaps that business school is like the anti-seminary. Which I laughed at because I was mentioning I just finished an MBA myself and I have an MDiv. But you've already used a couple words just in our conversation here that I think are interesting. Like you talk about scale, which is a very economic term, which replicable, which again, these terms in some church contexts would just make anyone run and scream the other way or shout in terror. Obviously, we're both seminary trained, so we appreciate theology and tradition and ethics and values. But I find, and I imagine you also, just a complete aversion to understanding some of these, business principles. Why do you think that is, and what do you think should be done differently?
Funny you say that, because I often have to be careful when I'm speaking. I'm happy to be very honest with you, but if I'm speaking to a mostly churchy crowd, I would have to be careful to not use terms like scale or personas or marketing. God forbid you say marketing. Yeah. Oh goodness. Yeah. I think that's
branding.
Usually when people are like, you're the spawn of Satan or something. I think something has happened, and as with most things like this, there is truth behind it, right? Mm-hmm. Capitalism has a lot. Oh my God, probably more flaws. If we were to sit down and have a long conversation over wine, I would probably get to the point where I would say I think capitalism has failed and we need to try something else. This is just not what God has wanted for the world. Yeah. It has created more harm than good, but you could probably say that about some church structures, right? Right. So that's it, though. So I think we look at capitalism and business as sort of the antithesis of what the church is. So that's evil, and to make a lot of money is evil, and whereas I don't necessarily, I don't want to travel into that ground, because again, I would probably reach that conclusion myself, right? Right. But that said, they have spent enormous amount of time, money, and resources to create frameworks. There's another word, right? Right. To create things that work, that they have proven work, right? They know enough about us, Facebook, all these, don't even get me started on social media. Yeah. But so they have put so much money into it, and some of these things work. So if we can use those tools or those frameworks or those ideas or those ways of thinking to actually better the church, if we're not hurting someone, right? I once was saying this to someone. He's like, all right, Lawrence, I see your point, but would you roofie someone for Jesus? I'm like, no, I would not. Good. That's an odd question. But that said, so if we can look at how the business world, for example, here's a great example. I was listening the other day to a book on audiobook. I was going to say book on tape, thus aging myself. Yeah. I was listening to an audiobook, and they were talking about Warren and the purpose-driven church, right? Yeah. And in that church, he says he created Saddleback Sam. Yeah. And this is when they were launching it, they said, Saddleback Sam is who we're going after. We're creating. So when he puts it that way, and he says, we're going to look for this person, and it looks like this, right? The one thing that he's not telling you in that book is this is a complete business way of looking at it, which is you create a persona and then you market to them to get the message to them so they will know, like, and trust. That's the basics of marketing. Know, like, and trust. But is that not also the basis of evangelism? People have to get to know that you exist. No. They have to get to like you before they're willing to go into relationship with you. And then they have to trust you before they're going to give their relationship with God over to you and how you do the message. So know, like, and trust. So we can use those terms. We can use that knowledge that is how people think, and that why not use that for the betterment of the church? Now, I am in no way advocating that we should hurt people, that we should misuse resources, that we should harvest people. Basically, that's what corporations do, right? They harvest the talent of people. That's not at all what I am saying. That said, what I think we can do is we can think strategically, not to use that word, but we can think of it and say, like, are these tools perhaps something that in consultation with each other, in discernment of prayer, that we can use for the betterment of the church. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously there's a lot in the business world, whether it's the Gordon Geckos or the Milton Friedman, that profit is, the ultimate good, but there's also, I think, folks who are fairly level-headed, like, I like listening to Simon Sinek. He start with why. I think there's a lot of crossover there. I'm a big fan of story brand marketing. If you know Donald Miller and J.J. Peterson, what problem are you solving? Because we often talk about, folks will talk about like, oh, if your church was missing, how would the neighborhood miss you? Like, if they're missing you, it's because you're solving a problem for them, right?
Yeah, it's just a different way of approaching. It doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. You can arrive at all of these things probably through long-term discernment. It's the same way that you can build a building with a hammer and with nails and wood. You can totally do that. Or you can use more modern technology to help you do that. So it's not saying that one is right and one is wrong. You're still going to build a house, but one is likely to happen faster and to be a different way of doing it. So not right or wrong, just a different way. So I think that, and again, to the point, right? Greed is good. Remember Gecko? Oh God, that was and that was that was my Generation X, where that was sort of what we were driven by. And I just think that, and this ties it all back, I think, to where we began, which is being centered in prayer and on God. I'm not doing this to make profit. I'm not doing, and rest assured, I'm also not doing this work to get more people in church for the sake of getting more people in church. This has to be about making disciples. This has to be about sharing the incredibly good news of a God who loves us so much, that has always been there when we turned away, and eventually was just like, all right, I'm going to go and be with you and enter time and space to show us the way of doing it. So that's the amazingly awesome news that we get to share with the world. And so I'm all for, if we're centered on that, let's use whatever tool we can, because I don't think if you're centered on Jesus, you could be sort of like so unethical. If you really are centered and try to be as pure and to that call, then the work you do will naturally be good work. I just think that's the way that works.
Okay, let me ask this question then, perhaps from a contrarian point of view, because I'm thinking of, I don't know, do you know the name Craig Groeschel? Craig, well, I'm blanking on it. He's an evangelical guy, Life Church. Interestingly enough, they're based in Oklahoma. They're starting a North Denver metro branch because, of course, Craig Groeschel, I think. Anyway, he'll say something like, I want to get as close to the line, I'll try everything up to the point of sin, which to me is like, again, he's framing it from an evangelical context. I think that's what often many church people hear. They wouldn't frame it that way. They'd be like, I don't want to get anywhere near anything that could be possibly unjust or ungodly. What would you say to something like that perspective? How would you say, hey, that's not what we're doing here?
So I'll give you an example. We created a couple of years ago, I was watching this show on Comedy Central called Drunk History. Which is a really funny show, right? And it has people that get drunk and they tell you a story from history. And then what happens is they get actors to reenact as this person is telling the story, and they're getting more and more drunk, so the story is getting wilder and crazier as it goes. And I thought, hey, I wonder what would happen if we did that with Bible stories. Would younger people be more apt to still see the biblical truth, right? Because the story is still told, and it is a true story in Drunk History. So could we do something like that for Drunk Bible? And I shared it with my nephew. He's like, oh my God, I would even pay for something like that. So we're like, we should try it. Let's just go and try and see what happens. And I announced that we were doing that. And I heard back from people saying that how hurtful this is, that the church should not be in that space, that making fun of this. And what I realized then, and we created sort of the rule for TryTank, which is first do no harm. There are many ways of achieving God's goals that are not harmful. So why go towards something that I could have said, no, this is actually going to be really good for young people and we're going to attract many young people. But I chose that no, if someone's going to be hurt by us actively doing something that's supposed to bring people closer, then are we really doing God's work in that? So that's when I said, I don't think so. And we backed out. We said, no, we're not going to do this. We refuse to hurt people along the way. So I don't think that I would go as far as say I will do anything but cross the line to sin, because that I don't think we need to be anywhere near that line. Yeah. I don't think that the Spirit would get us close to that line. So I would imagine that no, I don't agree with that. And using business terms and business frameworks does not by itself I think business in and of itself is. And keep in mind, by the way, even with all the mishaps that Wall Street does and all that, the majority of people in this country are employed by small businesses. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, small businesses are, heart of the earth, just really good people trying to do good work for their communities. They're the plumbers, the electricians, the services industry that we have. So I think business for them, and most of those are good, God-fearing, Christians that go to church on Sunday that are doing good and they're trying to do the best they can. So I don't think we can just with a broad brush say everything's out.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is the importance of kind of having some values and guidelines to kind of to keep things,
centered on prayer.
Right.
I really do think that if you are centered on prayer, if you keep a good rule of life that involves prayer, and also don't do it in isolation. I think I have a lot of conversation partners that I talk to about it, like, hey, am I totally crazy and thinking blah, 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 blah? And they'll be like, no, yeah, you're totally crazy. Walk away. Don't do that. Don't do that. And I always think that ideas get better, not to sound too much like a Presbyterian, but I think they get better when we do them as a group in conjunction with others. So one of the things we're trying to do now at TryTank is we're trying to do work with the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Methodists. We're trying to, all of them have now sort of set up innovation offices. So can we all get together and be like, how do we help each other out? But this is God's work that we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of shift gears here a little bit and just talk more nitty-gritty in the church context. So you write that trying and failing is not a big deal. And I just want to, like, again, I guess I'm being contrarian here, but I'm so trained in church that I'm like, why is trying and failing not a big deal?
To be clear, one doesn't set out hoping to fail. That isn't what I'm saying with that statement, right? If you were to think of everything that we do must succeed the way that we planned it, then we would never get anything done because we would never be that sure that anything's going to succeed. And I mean, look at the biblical witness. Mm-hmm. The apostles, all but John, were martyred. So did they fail in doing their work? We would say that they did, right? So fortunately, when I fail with an experiment, I don't get martyred. So please don't. That's not a hint for my bosses that let's martyr Lorenzo and make an example. What I am saying is that God is always calling us into something new. Mm-hmm. God is always inviting us to meet God in different places, and by doing that, to be able to bring God to different places. But we don't know those places. And by definition, as we try to travel into those places, we're going to mess up. We're going to be like, oh, okay, so that's a no-end situation there. You don't want to go down that street, right? So imagine you just moved to a city and you're trying to get somewhere. It's only by trying the different routes. Well, nowadays, I guess that's no longer as valid since we have GPSs.
Right.
Waze would get you over 3 people's parking lots to get you there. But if we look at it as how can we really meet God in these other spaces so that we can bring others to meet God as well, then we have to be willing to try things even if they're going to fail. And to be clear, out of I think we have 87 experiments that we've done to date, 2 out of 3 fail.
Say that
and I'm
again.
proud of that.
Say that
2
again.
2 out of 3 of our experiments
2
fail.
out of 3 fail.
And to be clear, not once did I begin an experiment saying, this is going to fail. I've said, this one's going to be tricky, but if it works, it's going to be amazing. And that's what's exciting. And it reminds me, the bishop who ordained me sent me out to one of the poorest communities. He said, go there. I was going to close him, but I chose not to close him. I think the Holy Spirit is still with him. So go and just be innovative with him. Go and try different things. And I'm like, great. How will we know, Your Grace? How will we know in 2 or 3 years if we're succeeding in this work we're doing? And he just looks at me and is like, what? It's like, yeah, how will we measure whether or not we're succeeding? Lorenzo's business sort of way of thinking. Right. And he said, because we love them, because we're faithful to the call. That's all we have to do. And it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And that's, I think, the way that we look at this work is We're not trying to save the church, right? We don't need to save the church. It's God's church, and God will do God's work. What we're trying to do is live into a new way of being in the world that's different than what it was, right? We're not in the 1950s. We no longer have the Cold War. We have young people. We have, for the first time ever, we have a generation coming in. This would be the Zs, who the oldest of which is 25, 26 this year, and the Alphas, who are 9 this year. The oldest Alpha is 9, right? So these two generations are coming in, and the thing that happened is the millennials before them said, I'm not going to baptize my kids. I'm going to let them choose when they're older.
Right.
So we have these two generations coming in that aren't even baptized. And yet 2 years ago, we saw the number of nuns, those who choose no religious affiliation, start to go down, which begs the questions like, they're making choices, but they're not choosing Christianity. Where are they going?
Yeah.
And they're doing a lot of do-it-yourself spirituality. They're doing a lot of, like, Wiccan is up and paganism. And so and also because they don't, even though they would culturally call themselves Christian, they refuse to associate with they just see it as one big thing, Christianity, that they find to be exclusionary and hypocritical. So they're like, no, we're not going to choose that. So I think that we can see that and be like, we're in trouble and we're all going to die, right? All of our congregations are going to close. Or we can see that as an invitation from God to be like, hey, some of my sheep are going elsewhere. How do we bring them this good message? How do we reach out to them and say, hey, what we have to offer is a lot of what you're thinking about. When you're thinking about income inequality and thus you support Bernie Sanders, the prophets have been talking about that for a long time. When you're out there on the streets for Black Lives Matters, justice is what God has been talking about forever.
Years.
When you talk about the environment, God gave us this environment and said, you are to take care of it from the book of Genesis. All of these things that you're saying is what you believe and want to stand for, so do we. So let us reconnect in some way. And if our answer is going to be, well, we're just going to keep doing it the way we were doing it, which is to build a church and just hope that they walk in. Well, that's one way.
Right.
Or we can enter into conversations with them where they are and where they're living their lives and be like, hey, we have some things to talk about, that we can talk about. And also, by the way, honor the fact that they may not use terms that we use, like transcendence or community or all these other things. But they have a relationship with the divine. They have a relationship with God. And it is up to us as the elders, if you will, to go and talk to them about, like, let me share with you my faith and why I'm such a happy person, why this joy, right? Jesus in Hebrews was anointed with the ointment of joy. So I think and John 10:10, that we're to have life and have it abundantly. All of these things, life is meant to be good. And if we live Christianity well, that doesn't mean that there aren't problems and we need to focus on those problems and to tear down systemic racism, all those things. But we need to begin with a place of joy, that is where God meets us, and thus meet them in that place so that we can bring them along for the work.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to, I find I keep asking like contrarian questions. So I hope it's not coming across that way, but I'm passionate about this and want leaders to catch on to this. So I think one of the challenges that I've seen often in churches, especially small, struggling mainline churches, is this kind of like pressure of like, we have to like hit on everything. So there's not a lot of resources. So what happens is like, well, we're only going to try one or two things and those have to hit. And then when they don't hit, it's like, well, we can't try anything again. And, you write in your book, like, even doing everything right, some things won't work. So what do you advise like church leaders or pastors who like want to try something, but there's not a lot of resources. And again, there's this kind of like institutional pressure, like if we're going to try something, it has to work.
I'm going to add one on top of that.
Yeah.
Not only does it have to work, when it doesn't work, when we quote unquote fail, then we think not only have we failed the institution and our church, we failed God.
Right.
And there's a psychological weight that goes on top of you when you think you failed God. And I think part of what we need to do there is to be reminded of just how much God loves us, and that there is nothing that we could do that would take away, Romans 8, right? Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus. And so the way that we do this is by doing it. And in the book, right, I talk about what's the minimum viable prototype that we can try. Again, these are business terms, but I'll give you another example. One of my distinctly famous failures, if you will, I did this thing that I thought was a great idea. I discovered that people were not going to church, right? I discovered, like, Lorenzo, wow, really? You discovered America, dude. Well done. But I also discovered that people were going a lot more to, like, group fitness classes. And I'm like, hey, wait a moment. Yeah. Is it possible that people are finding their spirituality through group fitness classes? Yeah. And then I saw this thing called a Soul Cycle, which are these huge spinning cycle rooms, right? Spin studios. And you enter one of them, seriously, like the lights are dim and they have candles on the wall and it says, find your soul. And then when it begins, the instructor is like, there's only this day and it was created for you. So I'm like, oh my God.
That's just throwing spiritual messaging.
Yeah, I know, right? Throwing a Jesus in there. That's a sermon. Yeah. You got it going on. So of course, Lorenzo's brilliant idea was like, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we make it just a full on Eucharistic service? Let's do spin church. And so we tried it out. The answer is no. People who are already finding spirituality through group fitness are already finding spirituality through group fitness. So they don't necessarily need to come to yours. You might as well just open up another church. That's what you're doing. You're competing for that.
Yeah.
But what I discovered through that process was this concept of the minimum viable prototype, right? So in olden days, the way we would have done this experiment of spin church is like, okay, I guess we have to go out and lease a space, and we got to go out and either lease or buy the 30 bikes that we're going to have, and we've got to market, and we've got to sign, the lease is going to be for 5 years, and we're going to have to hire staff, so you're $250,000 in, and then it doesn't work. And,
easy.
Yeah. Then it's like, well, it didn't work. So obviously you can't try anything else because you've let go of all your resources in that one. Our experiment did not pass $3,000, and we ran it for 8 weeks. Wow. We rented a spin studio. We advertised it. We ran like 160,000 impressions of our ads. They were seen by 27,000 people. Right. Like 1,200 of them touched on the ad. They somehow liked it, shared it, whatever. 10 people signed up and nobody went, right? But we were able to follow up with those 10 people to say, like, hey, can I just ask you some questions? Why didn't you go? You signed up, all these things. And that's how we know they already are finding their spirituality through other methods, right? So for $3,000 rather than, $300,000, we were able to try it by doing what's the minimum thing that we can do to test it. I even could have, we probably, if we had fewer resources, we could have figured out a way. Could we just do it through advertising and then call those people and ask them, like, what would you expect? What would it look like? That's why the framework then in the book is, you do the research, you do the discovery phase first. Most people in the church begin at step number 2, which is come up with ideas. And then step number 3 is to try it. So if you and I were like in a congregation, I'd be like, okay, Lauren, here's what we're going to do. We need to reach young people. And you'd be like, okay, let's come up with how we're going to reach young people. I know. What if we build them like a skate park? I'm like, oh, brilliant idea. Right. Young people are always skating. Right? They're not. They're not doing it through like the metaverse. They're not doing it out and about. And so we go out and build it. And then we spend, $10,000 on building this skate park, and no kids show up. And then we're like, well, what happened? Why are they showing up? This is why we don't try new things. And then what we didn't do was find out, what are young people into these days? What would they want to do? Did we go and sit with them and say, hey, if we wanted to build something just for you to hang out and spend time with, what would that look like? What would it feel like? Did we find out whether or not there's young people near us? I mean, I live in Palm Springs. If you build a skate park here, good luck, in this retirement community in reaching those young people. So I just, that first step of finding the data, is so important, so that we can actually then come up with actual something that serves. See, I was going to say serves the market, right? Let me put it in churchy terms. Yeah. In order for us to reach the unchurched or de-churched now, we need to find out how they would like to experience spirituality. That's called market research. And then finding out how they would want to experience spirituality, as long as it doesn't go against who we are as a church, then let's be willing to try it. So it's like, okay, let's build that for you and try it. We keep seeing, for example, from our evangelical brothers and sisters, that church on Friday night or Thursday night is very successful. In
Yeah.
some places, even more than Sunday,
Yeah.
because Sundays have become so busy with everything else.
Right.
But so many of us are still like, no, church is Sunday morning at 9:00, and you don't change that. It's like, or do we? Why don't we change that? Last time I checked, Moses only came down with 10 rules, or 15 if you follow Mel Brooks, right?
Yeah.
He only came down with 10 rules written in stone. Everything else is us. So maybe God is calling us to try it a little bit different. And why don't we?
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question before we take a break. We've been talking around like frameworks, using that term a lot. So explain for our listeners what you mean by frameworks and how they can be helpful in a church context.
Absolutely. A framework is basically a step-by-step guide. That's all that means. It means that it gives you sort of the outline of what you sort of need to do and the order you need to do it so that you can follow it. And what I find when I go around talking to people about the church, how it needs to change, innovation in the church, they get it. They're like, I totally understand, but I don't know how, right? So going back to, remember Saddleback Sam?
Right.
I was basically writing to, retired Susan, who is on a vestry. She's 67, and she's like, I get that we need to reach younger people because I look around and I don't see young people. And so add 20 years and they're not going to be here, but I don't know how. So when I wrote this short book was like, how would she understand it? How would she be able to get what I'm talking about? And so I broke down design thinking, which is normally like 8 steps. I said, no, that's way too many.
Right.
That a framework needs to be simple and that whoever the intended audience will do. And so I wrote it in just 3 steps, right? How do you do the discovery phase? How do you do the idea phase? How do you do the trying phase? So in a way that's another way of looking at frameworks, by the way, it's a recipe. A recipe is a framework to make a cake.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So, and that's what this book is, by the way. And by the way, I also need to mention that the book is now available on audio. It's also on Audible now. So if you're not yet sick of my voice and you want to hear me read the book to you for 4 hours, you can get it on Audible.
Well, make sure to send me a link to that, and I'll include it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, last question here before we take a break. What advice do you have to pastors, church leaders in this, I hate to say post-COVID because it seems like we're never going to be post-COVID, but post, the 2-year crisis since COVID, I guess.
The endemic that is becoming COVID, right? I think that, and after COVID now, we're probably going to end up in some sort of financial issues with monkeypox. And then there will always be things that are there, right? What I think COVID has shown us, right? COVID proved to us that we can do digital church. And that before COVID, we weren't doing digital church. Church was only on Sunday at a particular time. Now, digital church actually provides us an opportunity to be like, oh, we can meet people throughout the week in other ways. It's like, so that's one thing. It's like, how else might we be able to meet people throughout the week now that we know we have digital tools and we can use those digital tools? But I think it's also an opportunity, for us to rethink how we're doing. And here, I know we're about to go on break, but I'm going to drop a bomb here on you. When was the last time that the church said, what's our goal? Our goal is, in the Episcopal tradition, Book of Common Prayer, page 855, we're to reconcile people to God and by making disciples, right? That's what we're to do. Or if you're not an Episcopalian and you've heard of the Great Commission, right? Go out and make disciples. That's pretty much what we're called to do. We're called to bring this amazing good news to the world. Great. If that's our goal, when was the last time that the church sat down and said, okay, pause for a second, time out. Do we have the structures set up now to do that the best? Or should we change our structures completely?
Yeah.
Or are our structures right now set up mainly to maintain the structures and not to do our goal? That, if I say that to some people, they will shoot me because they're like, wait, you're questioning everything. I'm like, yes, because we should question everything. Our goal is to make disciples. And every once in a while, we need to think about it and say are we doing the best we can? This would be no different than when refrigerators came about and somebody asked, hey, are we doing the best way to keep things cool by still having someone deliver ice that we literally put into a box and we call an ice box to keep things cool? Or is the more effective way now to do this thing that we plug into the wall and it keeps it cool? every once in a while, we're called upon, going to Simon Sinek, if we're playing the infinite game and not just they're trying to solve the problems game, because then it becomes like, if we're only solving problems, then what we're looking at is like, how do we get people more people back in church so that we can maintain the churches? Right? That's a very limited game. The finite, the infinite game rather, is are we making disciples? Because that's what we're called upon to do. And if we're doing that, then it behooves us every once in a while to question, are we doing it the best way we can, or should we consider something else as a way of doing it? And it doesn't mean that we have to get rid of everything we have. It just means that we need to think about new and different ways of doing to try to get our goal.
Well, that's great. I wish we had more time to dive more into that, but let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Lorenzo Lebrija, and thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. I'm still nervous about pronouncing your name, so hopefully I got it right.
Just call me Lorenzo. Lorenzo's good. I tend to be the only Lorenzo in most groups that I go to, so everyone just knows me as Lorenzo.
You can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like? What would you want to accomplish? Something like that.
It'd be weird as an Anglican who's married to be Pope for a day, but hey, I'll take it. I would if I were Pope for a day, I would try to figure out how we can de-church spirituality as much as possible to make it more about people and the relationship with God, because I think that's what Jesus was about. The church provides wonderful structures, amazing opportunities to gather and worship together. Those are great things. But when it hinders people from getting closer to God and having a relationship with God that's palpable, that they can feel and influences their lives, then we should consider whether or not that's the best thing we can do.
Very intriguing answer. I like it. A theologian or historical figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Bring back to life. Wow. Just for the sake of like, hey, walk around.
Yeah.
When you say Christian historical figure, obviously the correct answer is Jesus. No, but he's already been brought back to life. So, someone that I would love to have, there are three. There are three that I would just love to have some conversations with Augustine about, like, dude, can we talk a little about sexuality? I think you can we just talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Just I think the things you laid down might be misconstrued in the future. So let's have a little conversation about that. Maybe just to add more clarity to your writings.
Yeah, sure.
So I would love to get some further explanation from Augustine about sexuality. Aquinas is someone that I would just love to sit there and just have a long conversation with. It's like, pretend that I don't believe in God and just convince me through all your incredibly logical ways about something as unlogical as love. So convince me not that there is a God, because it's the logical conclusion. Convince me through logic that God is love. I would just love to have that conversation with him over some beers. And then the final one would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'd love to have a conversation with Reverend Bonhoeffer about sort of like, I'm all for not doing cheap grace, but can we talk a little bit about the level of sacrifice? Because I think many of us think that unless we're suffering a lot for God, then we're not doing enough for God at that point. So I would just love to. That's just for my own edification. Actually, that one has nothing to do with greater, societal ramifications.
Well, I think clergy could benefit from that third conversation.
I think, and also because think about the people we hold up, the people whom we name days for, are generally people who were martyred or just had horrible endings. Like, could we not hold up someone that died happily in their bed and had a wonderful life, but was just a great pastor and just and reminded people that, I am not in the Reformed tradition, but I still find every once in a while, I like to listen to Robert Schuller.
Yeah.
Because his joy of Christianity is such like, do we always need to just be so focused on the sinful part? Yes, I know we're sinners. Trust me, I know we're sinners. But God forgives us, and that should give us joy. Not like I need to be contrite and put my head down all the time, but no, God has forgiven me, so I get to live into this joy again. Again, you'll discover that I'm a very joyful person, so it might just be my own thing.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Certainly COVID, and I do think that in the next 10 years, we're going to start to see a drastic change in I was reading this book about Generation Z. Again, I do a lot of reading, I read 6 newspapers. I skim 6 newspapers a day, and I try to just to be up into what's happening.
Mark Driscoll here, huh?
No. He was one book a day, right? Absolutely not. And I am the opposite of his machismo. And so, but anyways, I was reading this amazing book about. I'm trying to think of the name. Where is it? Anyways, I'll try to think of the name. I think it's called Fight. Anyways, the great quote from this book is, Generation Z will change America more than growing up in America will have changed Generation Z.
Wow.
And he goes on to explain they're not going to buy into this whole Americana, the American dream. They're not all of that, which is what we normally take as America. So all these structures that are set up, they're going to, when they come of power, when they come into their own to take over, they're going to be like, no, we're done with that. And we're going to change that over there. They're finally going to make the changes that we probably should have done a long time ago, particularly when it comes to like climate change. So it is amazing to me to just in expectation to sort of figure out what are they going to do to the church? How are they going to change the church? And we at TryTank are about to embark in some ethnographic studies of 25-year-olds and whatnot, just to try to figure out where's your spirituality? Where's the church there? Or how can the church be better prepared to meet you there in your spirituality? Because they're going to change us. They're going to change us drastically. And I want us to be ready for that in an amazing open arms sort of way. Not like, oh my God, we got to fight them off, right? They're coming to change us. It's like, no. I welcome you. I want this change. I'm just excited by that. So I think what this current time and place will be known as is when we're finally starting to see, now that they're turning 25, 26, Generation Z is coming into their own. We're at the beginning of what will be dramatic changes in the world that are coming.
Yeah, that's very intriguing. What do you hope then, like in response to this coming change, like that I don't know, church will respond better to these younger folks. These younger folks will find reason to value in the church. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
What do you hope for the wow? It's a good thing this is a final question. It's like, hey, Lorenzo, just in passing, what do you think of the future of Christianity?
And make it 30 seconds or less, by the way.
Right? It's like, oh, okay, sorry. I hope that we find a way of showcasing to younger people the relevancy of the story of Jesus Christ. That we find it, because it is very relevant. My life is what it is because of my relationship with Jesus, and that doesn't make me someone who walks around in the supermarket trying to convert people, right? But it gives me more compassion, I hope, toward people. So not conversion, but compassion. It makes me a better person that wants to do more for my community. That makes me, right? All the things that we know engagement with Scripture does for a person. It just turns your life better. That we find a way of communicating that to them so that they realize how good it can be. Taste and see that the Lord is good, right? So these aren't new things, but it's coming. And that is coming. So my hope is that we will get there sooner rather than later as a church, rather than trying to just hold on to perhaps structures that are no longer serving us, or more importantly, are no longer serving our God, our mission in the world.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, and there's so much I wish we had more time to talk about, but we got to. Folks will probably get tired.
I could talk for hours about this work.
Yeah. Tell where people can connect with you, the TryTank, that kind of thing.
Sure. So TryTank is on the web at trytank.org. That's TryTank.org. From there, you can reach me. I'm a staff of one, except with the llama. So it's easy to get a hold of me there, or just Lorenzo at trytank.org. And it's enter into conversation with anyone who wants to have a conversation about innovation in the church. How does church work? Because I think that it is with each other that we can find the Spirit. It is, if it was just me, then it would be a selfish sort of ego-driven enterprise. Whereas I'm like, no, the wisdom of the church is in the church. So I'll talk to anyone. And so Lorenzo at TryTank.org. I'm also on Facebook, which is a place where people can also find me. And you can reach me at Facebook. Where am I? I'm Rev Lebrija, Rev Lorenzo. So it's facebook.com. Rev Lorenzo is where people can find me on Facebook. And as long as you don't expect me to like chat up on the Messenger app, then I'm fairly good at doing Facebook with you. And like I said, I love talking to people, and I set aside a certain amount of hours per week just so I can have conversations.
That's great. That's a good idea. It's a good idea. Good boundaries. The book is How to Try Design Thinking and Church Innovation. Really recommend it just for folks who are trying to get some idea of what to do and how that would even look to try something different. And again, I appreciate, Lorenzo, the spirit of trying and being okay with not everything having to work, but doing the homework first.
Exactly. I'll just finish with this. I was being introduced at a conference recently, and because of the fact that we try to model failure and we fail quite often, right? And I don't mind naming it as failure. People are like, "Oh, you always learn," and it's like, of course we do, right? But it was a failure. What we set out to do didn't work, so it's okay to call it a failure. But because the more we can do that, the more we can take away this power that is not. But I was being introduced as like, and the man who loves failure is all about failure. And it's like, well, let's not let's bring that back a little. I want us to succeed a little, but it's okay if we fail while we're trying.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time. Leave everybody with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
May the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, always be with us.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.